I never thought my quiet country property would become ground zero for a full-blown war with my homeowners association. But the day I found gray streaks of drying cement sliding down into my creek, I knew my life had just changed. My creek wasn't just a ribbon of water cutting through the back of my land. It was a part of me. Generations of my family had sat along its banks, fished in its shallows, and cooled their feet in its rippling current. The clear water ran from a natural spring higher up in the hills, so even in the hottest summer it stayed cold and fresh. The first clue that something was wrong came early one morning. I'd stepped out with a coffee mug intending to check the trail camera I'd set up for deer. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The water, usually crystal clear, looked murky and sluggish. Then I caught the acrid scent, wet cement. My boots crunched over gravel as I jogged closer, and what I saw made me stop cold. A thick gray sludge oozed down the embankment, settling across the shallow bed of the creek. It wasn't just runoff. Someone had dumped entire wheelbarrows of cement into my water. My first thought was, why? Who would do this? But the more I looked at the mess, the more I realized the answer was obvious. My HOA president, Karen Mitchell. The woman was a walking storm cloud of hairspray, pearl necklaces, and unsolicited complaints. If a blade of grass dared to grow half an inch taller than regulation height, she was at my door with a fine notice in hand. If my porch light bulb burned out for a day, she was threatening penalties for neighborhood safety violations. And now, apparently, she had decided to extend her crusade into the realm of natural waterways. I followed the trail of spillage back toward the property line, and sure enough, there were fresh wheel marks pressed into the mud. They came from Karen's side. My stomach tightened. That creek wasn't just decoration. It was protected land. I had permits, inspections, and state environmental documents that explicitly gave me stewardship over it. If the HOA thought they could bully me into filling it in because they wanted a prettier view, they had another thing coming. I spent the rest of the morning trying to clean what I could. With a shovel, I broke apart clumps of drying cement before they hardened fully. My back ached, my hands blistered, but it was no use. Cement mixed with water becomes rock. No matter how much I scraped, a good section of my creek bed was permanently altered. Fish that had darted joyfully through the pools yesterday were gone. Frogs had vanished from the reeds. The sight boiled my blood. By noon, I decided I wasn't letting this slide. I marched across the property line and knocked on Karen's door. It swung open, and there she was. Lipstick too bright, perfume too heavy, eyes sharp as broken glass. "Ah," she said, as if she'd been expecting me. "Finally ready to talk about that unsightly ditch of yours?" "Ditch?" My voice rose. "That's a creek, a protected waterway, and someone just dumped cement into it. The wheelbarrow tracks lead straight from your yard." Karen's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. "You mean the safety hazard that breeds mosquitoes?" "Yes, I instructed some contractors to handle it. The HOA voted that it needed to be filled. An eyesore, really. You should be thanking me." My hand tightened into a fist at my side. "You can't vote away state law. That creek is on my property. You trespassed, you destroyed an ecosystem, and you think I should be grateful." Her tone shifted into that syrupy sweet condescension she'd mastered. "Listen, dear. Sometimes decisions need to be made for the greater good. You may own the land, but we—" She gestured broadly as if the entire neighborhood was behind her. "We own the view. And our property values matter." I wanted to scream, but instead I forced my voice low and steady. "Undo it! Now! Get your contractors back here and clean up every ounce of what you dumped." She tilted her head, feigning pity. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. Cement doesn't exactly unpour. Consider this your notice. You're in violation for having an unapproved water feature. Fix it or the HOA will escalate." That was the moment I realized what I was up against. Karen wasn't just nosy or controlling, she was ruthless. She'd broken the law and was now flipping the blame back onto me. That night, as I sat at my desk flipping through property documents, my mind spun. I had evidence, photos of the cement, the tracks, the damage. I could call the Department of Environmental Quality. I could call an attorney. But part of me hesitated. I knew Karen. If I struck directly, she'd double down. She thrived on conflict, turned everything into a performance of martyrdom in front of the HOA board. I needed a plan that didn't just defend my creek. I needed a plan that would make her regret ever touching it. The answer came, ironically, from the creek itself. As I sat out back, staring at the now damaged waterway, I noticed how the flow had shifted. The cement had blocked certain channels, forcing the current underground. The water pressure built up against the barrier, trickling out in unexpected spots along the bank. And that's when it hit me. Water always finds a way. You can block it, divert it, bury it, but eventually it breaks through. Karen had poured her arrogance straight into my creek. Maybe it was time I let nature take care of the rest. The next week was a blur of phone calls and quiet maneuvering. I documented everything: videos, timestamps, water tests. I submitted complaints to the county, the state, even the EPA. But publicly, I stayed calm, even civil. To the HOA board, I acted like I was letting it go. Karen grew smugger with each passing day, strutting around at neighborhood meetings, bragging about how she'd handled the problem. What she didn't realize was that every bucket of cement she'd poured had created a dam that redirected the underground flow straight toward her property. It started small. A wet patch appeared near her back patio. She thought it was just a sprinkler leak. Then the ground softened, squishing underfoot. Her landscapers came out, puzzled by the persistent moisture. By the end of the month, the entire foundation along the rear of her house was damp. I didn't say a word. I simply sat on my porch, watching, waiting, sipping coffee. One stormy night, the sky ripped open with rain. The creek swelled, straining against its artificial walls. The redirected water surged underground, pressing harder and harder against Karen's basement walls. By morning, her pristine white curtains fluttered out of open windows as crews rushed in with pumps and hoses. Word spread fast. Karen's basement had flooded, and not just with muddy water. My fish, the ones that had vanished from my creek weeks ago, had found a new home. Neighbors whispered about how surreal it looked. Colorful trout darting around Karen's basement like some twisted aquarium. For the first time in years, I felt myself smile at the thought of her standing ankle-deep in her own mess, watching helplessly as nature took back what she'd stolen. This was only the beginning. Karen Mitchell's meltdown was neighborhood theater at its finest. The morning after her basement turned into a reluctant aquarium, I saw her out on the lawn in a silk robe, hair undone, shouting into 2 phones at once. Her perfectly manicured yard had become a mud pit. Men in neon vests clomped around with sump pumps and hoses, their boots sinking deep into the soggy ground. A news van even rolled up because apparently someone had tipped off the local station about an environmental disaster in the subdivision. I sat on my porch with my coffee, pretending to read the paper. In reality, I was watching the circus unfold. And when I say circus, I mean Karen in full meltdown mode. Do you understand who I am? She shrieked into the phone, pacing back and forth. This is not acceptable. My home is supposed to be the model of the community, not a fish tank. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. By mid-afternoon, the HOA board had gathered in her driveway like anxious hens. They wore their usual uniforms of pressed polos and nervous smiles, whispering among themselves as Karen stormed back and forth. One of them, Alan from 2 houses down, kept stealing glances toward me. He knew, they all did. They knew Karen's bright idea of pouring cement into my creek was the root of this disaster, but none of them had the backbone to say it aloud. I didn't approach them. Not yet. Timing was everything. If I stepped in too early, Karen would spin the narrative, accuse me of sabotage, claim I'd rigged the land somehow. No, I needed to let her own arrogance bury her first. That night, I heard the pumps running well past midnight. Their throaty hum echoed across the neighborhood. I imagined Karen lying awake in bed, listening to the steady drip, drip, drip of water invading her basement walls, feeling her empire crumble. The next morning, a knock rattled my door. When I opened it, I found Alan standing there, wringing his hands. Hey, he started awkwardly. Got a minute? I leaned against the door frame. Sure. He glanced over his shoulder as if afraid Karen might leap out of the bushes. Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but the board didn't approve what Karen did. The whole cement thing, that was her call. She bullied us into silence like she always does. But now it's a mess. I kept my face neutral. That's between you and your president, Alan sighed. Come on, man. We're neighbors. The state's involved now. Inspectors are coming tomorrow. If they find out the HOA tampered with a protected creek, it's not just her on the hook. We're all liable. Fines, lawsuits, the works. That was the opening I needed. Then maybe it's time, I said slowly, that you all stop letting her run the show. Alan's eyes widened. He wanted me to elaborate, but I didn't. I simply shut the door and let him chew on the idea. Over the next few days, Karen's world unraveled further. The inspectors arrived, poking around the creek with clipboards and cameras. They asked me questions and I answered politely, showing them every document I had. The permits, the before and after photos, the wheel tracks leading from her property. They nodded gravely, muttering about violations and unauthorized dumping. Meanwhile, Karen tried every trick in the book. She smiled sweetly at the inspectors, offering them coffee and cookies, acting like she was the gracious victim of some tragic natural occurrence. When that didn't work, she switched to hostility, accusing me of staging the whole thing. "He must have rerouted the creek," she snapped at one inspector. "He's always been difficult, always resistant to HOA standards." "This is sabotage!" The inspector gave her a look colder than the creek water. "Ma'am, cement doesn't magically pour itself." I nearly laughed. The flood cleanup became a neighborhood spectacle. Kids on bikes rode past Karen's house to gawk at the giant hoses snaking out her basement windows. Adults whispered behind cupped hands about how the queen bee finally got stung. Even those who'd once been her loyal lapdogs began to distance themselves. I'll never forget the night. I caught sight of her standing alone on her porch, staring out at the ruined lawn. For the first time, she didn't look like the untouchable tyrant of the HOA. She looked small, fragile, defeated. But my sympathy only went so far, because while she wallowed in her mess, I was busy strengthening my case. The inspectors had confirmed what I suspected. Her cement had redirected the creek's natural flow underground, straight toward her foundation. Her greed had literally backfired. And now, with evidence piling up, I had leverage. The question was how to use it. I considered pressing charges immediately. Trespassing, environmental damage, property destruction. The list was long, but a small mischievous part of me wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted poetic justice, so I played patient. I waited. A week later, the HOA called an emergency meeting in the community center. Word spread quickly, and by the time I arrived, the room buzzed with tension. Karen sat at the front, makeup caked on thick to hide the exhaustion etched across her face. She banged a gavel dramatically. "Order. We need to address the outrageous situation plaguing our neighborhood." Murmurs filled the room. Someone whispered, "Her basement aquarium?" And a ripple of laughter broke out. Karen's jaw tightened. "This is no laughing matter. Our property values are at risk. We must hold the responsible party accountable." Her eyes landed on me. "There he is," she announced, pointing like a prosecutor. "The man who weaponized a creek against us." The crowd gasped, but not the way she expected. All eyes turned to me, not with suspicion but curiosity. Some even looked amused. I stood slowly, letting the silence build. "You're right about one thing, Karen. This is no laughing matter. A protected waterway was illegally tampered with. Cement was dumped without permits. An ecosystem was destroyed. And now the natural flow has compromised your home." Karen's face flushed crimson. "Lies." I pulled out a folder and set it on the table. Photos, reports, inspector notes, all neatly organized. "These aren't lies. They're facts. And the county has them too. But don't worry, I made sure to highlight exactly where the wheelbarrow tracks crossed from your yard onto my property." Gasps rippled again, louder this time. Karen sputtered. But before she could form words, Alan stood up. "He's telling the truth," he said, voice shaking. "Karen ordered the cement. She threatened fines if we didn't back her up. None of us wanted this." The room erupted. People shouted over one another. Accusations, complaints, years of pent-up resentment spilling out. Karen slammed her gavel again, but this time nobody listened. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. The board had finally turned against her, and that was enough. Back at home, I walked down to the creek. The water was still murky, scarred by cement, but life was creeping back. A dragonfly skimmed the surface. A frog croaked from the reeds. Nature, relentless as ever, was healing. I dipped my hand into the current and whispered, "Thank you." Because deep down, I knew the creek wasn't just water and rocks. It was my ally. And together we weren't finished with Karen Mitchell. After that chaotic HOA meeting, the neighborhood was never the same. Karen's iron grip on the board had snapped like a brittle twig. Neighbors who once cowered under her threats now openly mocked her behind her back. Even the ones who had feared her most began to breathe easier. The invisible chain she'd wrapped around all of us had finally loosened. But Karen Mitchell wasn't the kind of woman to take defeat lying down. 2 days later, I caught her prowling near the property line again, wearing oversized sunglasses and pretending to walk her dog, a tiny yapping Pomeranian named Sparkles. Except Sparkles was clearly miserable, tugging on the leash while Karen scanned the creek like a general inspecting enemy territory. I leaned on my fence and called out, "Looking for more cement trucks?" Her head snapped toward me, lips curling. "You think this is over? You think your little stunt at the meeting makes you some kind of hero?" I didn't rise to the bait. It's not a stunt when it's the truth. She tugged Sparkles back toward her yard, but not before hissing, "You'll regret crossing me." The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. That night I made sure my trail cameras were running. Something told me Karen wasn't finished with the creek. Sure enough, 2 nights later the cameras caught her again. Only this time she wasn't alone. 2 contractors, the same ones I'd seen weeks before, were with her. They carried flashlights and equipment, pumps, hoses, buckets of sealant. Their whispered voices carried across the still night air. She was trying to cover her tracks. I stayed hidden in the shadows of my porch, phone recording the whole scene. The men worked quickly, slathering sealant along the embankment near her property, trying to patch the leaks that fed directly into her basement. Karen barked orders like a drill sergeant, her shrill voice echoing. "Faster! I don't care how tired you are. Do you know what the insurance adjuster said? They won't cover water damage if they find out it's because of that blasted creek." The irony almost made me laugh. She'd poisoned my land, and now nature was poisoning hers. By dawn, the crew was gone, leaving behind a scarred embankment. I walked down to inspect the damage. The sealant gleamed black against the natural earth, ugly and obvious. Worse, the men had dumped sandbags directly into the water to redirect the current again. My jaw clenched. Enough was enough. That afternoon, I called the inspector who'd handled my earlier complaint. I emailed over the new footage, time-stamped and clear. His reply came within hours. "We'll be escalating this matter. Expect a visit from the County Environmental Task Force within the week." I almost felt sorry for Karen. Almost. The visit came faster than expected. 3 county vehicles rolled up to her house the next day. Men and women in official jackets stepping out with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tools. The whole neighborhood gathered on sidewalks, pretending to work in their yards while really spying on the drama. I watched from my porch as Karen tried to intercept them. She waved her arms dramatically, voice carrying all the way to me. "You can't just barge onto private property. I demand to see a warrant." One of the officials calmly handed her a document. "Ma'am, this is a state-issued order. You interfered with a protected waterway. We have full authority." Her face went pale. For the next 2 hours, they inspected every inch of her property, especially the basement, which still reeked of mildew and river water. They tested soil samples, photographed the sealant, even took measurements of the sandbags in the creek. Karen followed them around like a furious hornet, buzzing and stinging with complaints, but they ignored her. When they finally left, she stood frozen on her lawn, fists clenched at her sides. The neighbors began drifting away, whispering gleefully. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Karen Mitchell was about to face consequences she could never control. That night, I celebrated with a quiet glass of bourbon by the creek. The water trickled softly as if thanking me for standing guard. But Karen, true to her nature, wasn't done. A few days later, I came home to find a thick envelope shoved into my mailbox. Inside was a letter, typed and dripping with venom. "Dear Sir, your repeated harassment of me and my property has gone far enough. If you do not immediately cease your baseless accusations and withdraw your complaints, I will be forced to pursue legal action for defamation, slander, and emotional distress. The HOA supports me fully in this matter, and you will find yourself outnumbered in court. Karen Mitchell." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the letter into the creek. Not only was it empty bluster, but she hadn't even realized that the HOA no longer supported her. In fact, the board had quietly reached out to me with apologies, eager to distance themselves from her madness. Still, the letter was a warning. Karen wasn't just arrogant, she was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. Sure enough, the escalation came at dawn 3 days later. I woke to the roar of engines outside. Rubbing my eyes, I stumbled to the window. What I saw made my blood boil. 2 bulldozers, on my property, and standing proudly in front of them was Karen, hands on her hips, shouting orders, "Clear it out! Level the ditch! If we get rid of it entirely, He can't complain anymore. My heart slammed in my chest. She was trying to destroy the creek outright. I grabbed my phone and sprinted outside. "Get those machines off my land!" I roared. The contractors hesitated, looking between me and Karen. She shrieked, "Don't listen to him. The HOA authorized this. He's just a tenant. He doesn't own the rights." That was her fatal mistake. I held up my phone, recording. "You're trespassing. This land is mine. The creek is state protected. And you," I pointed straight at Karen, "just gave me video evidence of your intent to commit environmental destruction." The bulldozer drivers shut off their engines immediately. One of them muttered, "Lady, you didn't say anything about it being protected land. We're not losing our licenses over this." They drove away, leaving Karen sputtering in the dust. I called the county that afternoon, sending them the video. The official on the other end didn't even try to hide his anger. "We've been patient with her. This crosses the line. We'll be pursuing full charges." The storm hit fast. Within a week, Karen was served with legal papers. The state charged her with illegal dumping, environmental tampering, and trespassing. Fines in the tens of thousands loomed over her head. Rumors swirled about possible jail time if she didn't comply with the cleanup orders. The neighborhood reveled in the downfall. People who once avoided eye contact with me now waved cheerfully as they drove by. Parents let their kids fish in the recovering creek, laughing about Karen's aquarium. The HOA board, desperate to salvage their reputation, voted to strip her of the presidency. For the first time in years, the community felt free. And Karen? She became a ghost. Her blinds stayed closed. Sparkles no longer yapped from the yard. The once bustling house was silent except for the faint hum of basement pumps. She stopped attending meetings, stopped patrolling lawns, stopped threatening fines. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender. Karen Mitchell wasn't the type to go down quietly. And I had a sinking feeling. The final act of this war was still to come. For a while, the quiet was almost unsettling. Karen Mitchell, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had vanished from sight. No more surprise inspections, no more angry glares from across the street, no more unsolicited letters threatening fines for invisible offenses. At first, the neighborhood celebrated. Barbecues popped up on weekends, kids played freely, people even started leaving lawn chairs on their porches again without fear of a violation notice. But I knew Karen. Silence wasn't peace. It was plotting. I kept my trail cameras running, checked the creek daily, and stayed in touch with the county inspectors. The legal process was grinding forward. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. Karen's charges were serious, and the fines alone were enough to cripple her finances. Rumors spread that she was fighting with her insurance company, begging them to cover natural flooding. They wouldn't. Not when the evidence showed man-made interference. Then, one night it happened. I was asleep when a loud crack shattered the quiet. My eyes flew open, heart pounding. Another crack followed, then a heavy metallic clatter. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and ran to the backyard. The beam of light swept across the creek, only to land on a figure standing knee-deep in the water. Karen. Her hair was wild, her clothes soaked, and in her hands was a sledgehammer. She swung it furiously at the embankment, smashing at the cement and rocks, shouting curses into the night. "You ruined everything," she screamed. "My house, my reputation. You think you've won, but I'll bury this damn creek if it kills me." Each swing sent shards of cement flying, water splashing higher. She was trying to destroy the evidence before the state's final inspection. "Karen," I shouted, "stop. You're making it worse." She whirled on me, eyes blazing like a cornered animal. "This is your fault. If you had just filled it in like I told you, none of this would have happened." Before I could respond, she swung again, this time striking a weakened section of cement. The wall gave way with a thunderous crack, releasing a surge of pent-up water. The creek roared back to life, slamming into Karen's legs. She lost her footing and screamed as the current dragged her downstream. I dropped my flashlight and sprinted along the bank. The water churned violently, tearing through the makeshift barriers she'd built. Branches snapped, mud slid, and Karen flailed helplessly. I finally spotted her clinging to a tree root, coughing and sputtering. "Hold on," I yelled, wading into the icy water. I grabbed her arm and pulled with everything I had, dragging her onto the bank. We both collapsed, soaked and shivering. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The creek thundered beside us, reclaiming its natural path with unstoppable force. Finally, Karen sat up, hair plastered to her face, eyes hollow. "It was supposed to be perfect," she whispered. "This neighborhood, this community, it was supposed to be mine. And now look at it. Look at me." I looked at her not as the tyrant who had made everyone's lives miserable, but as a broken woman who had built her entire identity on control. And now that control was gone. "The creek isn't yours to control," I said quietly. "It never was." She stared at me, tears mixing with rain. For the first time, I think she understood. The sirens arrived minutes later. A neighbor had called when they heard the crash. Sheriff's deputies and county officials swarmed the scene, flashlights cutting through the darkness. When they saw the broken embankment, the tools scattered in the mud, and Karen drenched from head to toe, the story told itself. "Ma'am," one deputy said firmly, "you're under arrest for violating a state environmental order and tampering with protected land." Karen didn't fight. She didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't call for Sparkles or the HOA. She just stood silently as they cuffed her, shoulders slumped, eyes on the ground. The neighborhood watched from porches and windows as the once feared HOA president was driven away in the back of a squad car. It was surreal, like watching a dictator toppled, a storm finally breaking. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was immense. Karen faced thousands in fines, legal fees, and mandatory cleanup costs. The HOA formally expelled her, stripping her of any authority. Her house, already weakened by flooding, went up for sale. But word spread quickly and no buyer wanted to touch the fish tank house. Eventually, foreclosure signs went up. Karen Mitchell was gone. And the creek? The county restoration team worked with me to undo the damage. They cleared the cement, reinforced the natural banks, and planted reeds and willows to stabilize the ecosystem. Slowly, life returned. Fish darted in the clear current again. Frogs croaked at dusk. Dragonflies danced in the sun. Neighbors came to see it too. Families brought their kids to splash in the shallows. Old-timers sat with fishing poles swapping stories about the Battle of the Creek. The once feared waterway Karen had tried to erase became the pride of the neighborhood. One evening, as I sat by the water with a cup of coffee, Alan from down the street joined me. He cast a line into the creek and sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, "we all should have stood up to her years ago. But you were the one who finally did it. You didn't just save the creek. You saved this whole community." I smiled faintly, watching the ripples on the water. I didn't do it alone. The creek fought back too, and it was true. Karen thought she could bend nature to her will, but in the end, nature always wins. As the sun set and the creek glowed gold in the fading light, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Because the tyrant was gone. The water was free. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood was truly ours again.